paper today is what someone a long time ago called a modest proposal. It's propositional. It's in the sense of towards a culture of materiality. It traces a hidden, displaced current that runs through 20th century modernism from Russia, from pre-Soviet Russia, pre-revolutionary Russia, to the post-war and contemporary legacy, as I've indicated very briefly, in Asia. The core of this current concern of mine is the materiality as explored by certain artists that I will show today, suggests that it reveals a history, in fact, of exchange and influence with certain aspects of modern and contemporary art in Asia, in particular Philippines, Japan, and Korea. He began to explore what became known as the concept of factura. The result was a three-dimensional painting reliefs. They're coming away from painting. They're opening up into the space itself. These were displayed in the first exhibition of painting reliefs in his studio in 1914. And then another exhibition shortly after, in 1915, called Tramway 5. He moved into what he called counter-reliefs, which were then exhibited shortly after in St. Petersburg. It denoted factura, F-A-K-T-U-R-A from the Latin, denoted the way in which materials are handled to produce a work of art. Factura implied not so much an invariable quality of the finished work of art, but rather a mode in the process of its production. These Russian artists believed in what has been characterized as a truth to materials, the focus of which was the medium and technique as the true constituents of the work of art. The medium and the technique. To speak of factura was to imply the specific substance or texture and the constructivist object that exists in the viewer's real space. It was, in a sense, a self-contained reality and entailed both an object of physical materials and its social context within which it served a need or function for the audience. But to return to the Russian constructivist moment, it was oriented towards materials and away from personal taste and towards an impersonal role of the artist. And we know, of course, this concept of artist and producer, which became very famous in the 1920s after the revolution. On the issue of form and construction, Tactile moved from counter-reliefs to corner reliefs, and then, of course, the famous monument to the Third International, which is well known. I should mention here, of course, Merewether, the founder of Suprematism, who painted the black square which we see up here in an installation of his work, 1915. And I must say that Merewether has always been and was the reason I moved from literature to art history a long time ago. He had by this point understood that Suprematism constituted the terminal stage of abstract art, that this art was connected with the cosmos, with cosmic vision. Merewether grasped the property of this new space where it escaped beyond the horizon. As such, Russian artists were developing an approach to artistic mediums that would be distinguished, that we can distinguish from the French. It was neither illusionistic nor about spatial organization as the French had conceived it. The Russians rejected the individualistic expression of the artist through the painterly depiction of real objects, thus seeking a new relationship to the world and its materiality. But Tatlin was not alone. And we should look at people like Popova and Rodchenko, as well as many others. Rodchenko and Popova made a lot of work during this period, 1917 through until the late 1920s, 1928, when the Soviet Union changed, unfortunately. And while Tatlin's counter-reliefs were mounted on the wall, Rodchenko and Popova began to do spatial constructions. And this work, which is from 1924, is from their studio, and it shows a kind of greater autonomy with which they were thinking about the work. And then I moved to Asia, and I wanted to first mention Robert Chebet of the Philippines, who is one of the pioneer artists in the Philippines for the 1960s on. And his work really is fundamentally important, not only in terms of a history of work in Asia, but also of its relations and correspondences with Europe. And he certainly looked not only at the American artists of his time, but also back into the European modernists. The second artist that I want to mention was Kishio Suga. Suga was a member of the Monoha and became terribly important because he outlived, in a sense, Monoha, and went on towards this opening up of the canvas into the space. And he writes, when I show an artwork in the interior of a building like a gallery or museum, I consider the room and the entire space of the interior to constitute the size of that work. In that sense, the positioning or placement of that work within the context of the space does not factor into my considerations. What matters to me is the act of transforming the nature of the space as a whole, or what I would call the situation. And this is Suga, young women. Thank you very much.
이어서 예술은 예술 전문가를 위한 것인가, 예술을 보는 이들을 위한 것인가, 마음, 신체의 불가피한 개입이라는 제목으로 프레일겐이 발표하겠습니다.
She was nice and kind in a way. People's eye had a woman. She was nice and kind in a way.
We live in exciting times of important changes in the art world that has factually become global. But, and this is real pragmatics, galleries, smaller museums, art fairs have less attendance. Many artists face financial difficulties just to be able to continue working. The gap between art professionals and art audiences has grown out of proportion. The real excitement about art almost seems to have lost its sparks. It is time we start thinking about the art audience as persons and refresh everything we know about art. Education, of course, is still important, but the art audience is definitely not uneducated anymore. Next slide, please. This quote could even be in a newspaper today, be it about politics or the art world. Long indulgence in error makes right thinking almost impossible. It's from the American philosopher William James from 1890, so more than 100 years ago. Where error can be understood as the erroneous fixation within one's discipline, and right thinking would involve considerations of the other, the not specialized person. Every specialized person needs frequently to check if his or her thoughts are still relevant and useful for the target group or the audience. Next slide, please. The 56th Biennial 2015 was the first time where many art lovers and collectors from Europe, the USA and various parts of Asia voiced their dismay about the art at the main biennial, expressing they much preferred the various other exhibitions involving a wide range of paintings and sculptures, including of course the impressive Dansequa exhibition, but also the brothers Jackson and Charles Pollock at the Guggenheim, and Frontiers Reimagined, the exhibition of the Tagore Foundation. I was happy to be allowed to feature a work of my own. If you allow me the first provocative thought, traditional painting and sculpture allow a visitor of an exhibition to decide instantaneously if they like to look at the work or not. The traditional art media, including of course what Charles just showed, are very liberal and democratic, while video and conceptual art have their own merit, but are per definition autocratic. Next slide, please. In our contemporary time, we still like looking at artworks from centuries ago and from cultures very different than our own. Now, why is that? Why is it that artistic expression relates so much through times and cultures, although the specific meanings locally are very different? Next slide, please. This again, you may consider a contemporary painting. It could very well be. It could be from any part in the world. It could even be from this part of the world. It's more than 8,000 years old. It's from prehistoric times, and it's not even from Europe. It's from Africa. Next, look at, yeah, it's okay. If you look at the lines and the kind of how the figures are painted, keep that in mind, and we go to the next. And that's of course Kandinsky. I will not go into the specifics, that Kandinsky was informed about prehistoric times and was also inspired. But you can see the expression is very similar. Next slide, please. This is of course from your own culture, from Goguryeo, if I pronounce it correctly, which was before 6th century, demonstrating that the interest in manually handling of materials in Korean culture is as old as the culture itself. If you go to the Leon Museum or the National Museum, you see also in the pottery, almost sometimes very similar colors and structures like in Dansequa. So it's for me, it's like not new or only following the modernists from the West. It's in the culture, as long as the culture exists. Next painting, please. Slide. This is from your fellow Korean, very important painter, Sang Iu Chang. And like Kai Hong sent me a long time a very interesting text about her as a shamanistic painter. Next slide, please. This could be Peter Doig. It's not. It's not from today. It's from 19th century Gustave Moreau, who was very inspired by India. Next slide, please. Natvar Bhavsar. This painting could be even Korean or East Asian. It's from an Indian gentleman living since the 60s in New York. A very brilliant artist. I'm very grateful to be his friend. He's now 85. The notion of imperfection or unfinishedness is the same, like Charles showed the black square of Malevich. I've seen the original at the Tretyakov Gallery. It's not perfect square. And that's exactly why it's interesting to look at. If it's a perfect square, it's for your eyes very quickly boring to look at. Can still be important, but that's a different aspect. When we combine various features, like the importance of physical involvement of the artist, the potentialities of motor reflexes, and the natural process of alignment, we will understand why the notions of imperfection or unfinishedness are probably keys for understanding art. Next slide, please. So let's summarize. The process of art experience. How can we summarize? And this is simple terms, of course. The encounter, first you have the encounter of the viewer as mind-body with the artifact, the artwork. The artwork by itself offers contrasts in materials and colors, attracting the eyes of the viewer to look at the work and look repeatedly, slowly scanning the whole artwork again and again. Because of this repetition is very important. because of that, the visual appeal is strengthened by unconsciously recognizing the artwork as manually made by another human, like I showed with Tintoretto. When the brain signal has sufficient strength, which only happens when you look in repetition, we become aware we are only focusing on that moment on looking at the artwork, temporarily forgetting our thoughts, concerns, sorrows. The resulting sense of well-being, like you can have in a museum or in an exhibition or in a studio, is what we call the art experience. So we have to focus on what works in art. What do we experience in works of art? What do you yourself like to experience in art? In public exhibitions, in your private environment at home? These are, of course, two completely different settings, but both questions are very interesting. It's also very important for all art not only to think in public collections terms, but also how you would like and what kind of art you would like to have in your private home to live with. The next slide, please. The viewer. While undoubtedly more knowledge will support the viewer to understand artworks better, the viewer should feel encouraged to primarily rely on the immediate response of his or her own mind, body, and let the eyes lead one to look where one naturally likes to look. It's something I'll ask all of you from now on when you go to exhibitions. Take a little time, don't start immediately talking to your friends. Look at the artwork and see where your eyes lead your vision to go. It's a very interesting experiment. It's interesting from biology, people know that your eyes do that anyway. So that's the big challenge for all of us professionals, both the creating part and the curators. Next slide, please. This is so-called theoretical eye tracking. There are many fantasies about eye tracking. The theory from psychology is that we first would look at faces in a painting, connecting these into compositional lines leading our eyes. I'll show you now actual eye tracking. Next. This image demonstrates actual eye tracking. Your eyes go all over the painting. The so-called, I'm not going to that because the time is running out. But after seeing this, I hope you understand my little joke to see the next slide. And of course, Jackson Pollock was not illustrating eye tracking lines, but that's exactly how his works are so fascinating to look from close by.
Hello. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for being here with us today. Thank you very much to Kate for inviting me to join you, and thank you to the APA Forum team. When Kate initially brought up the idea of participating in this forum, I was very intrigued because to me Korean art is something which is very fascinating. And I believe about 3 or 4 years ago, there was such a great deal of interest in two areas which people were considering new, emerging, exciting, unknown to viewers outside their own region. These two areas were Korea and Southeast Asia. So Kate, being based in Singapore, has very good engagement with the Southeast Asia region. And I thought it would be very pertinent to present to give you a presentation on Southeast Asian art, the processes and methods of engagement, because we can really see the way Korean art and Southeast Asian art have certain parallels and also certain divergences. I think both regions have been the recipients of transmitted methodologies and ideas from the West. At the same time, both regions also carry a certain sense of historical and cultural burdens, which leads to the artists feeling the sense of urgency to define their own space, define their own theories, and at the same time find their identities. And I think this is reflected greatly in the works of the modernists and also the contemporary artists. So I wanted to just discuss firstly the earliest developments in regarding to experimental painting methodology.
And there are two artists whom I thought were very interesting because they come from opposite sides of the spectrum, but somehow they managed to arrive at in the same space. The first artist is an Indonesian modernist called Affandi. He has been predominantly called the expressionist of the tropics and all these very flamboyant titles. But the main thing to remember is that he was not a trained artist in the conventional sense. He arrived at his aesthetics truly entirely through this method of self-discovery and tuning into who he was as an artist and his most base responses to color and technique. So all his works were created entirely without traditional implements. He used his fingers, his elbows, his wrists, even his feet sometimes, because he tried to create all his works while squatting or sitting on the ground. So if you observe his works, you will realize that the painting's perspective has been completely realigned to how he is approaching the canvas. So the first artist I wanted to mention is Fernando Zobel. Fernando Zobel was born in the Philippines, but he trained also in Harvard and the Rhode Island School of Design. He can be considered Southeast Asia's foremost and most prolific abstractionist, even though he lived most of his later life in Spain and he eventually became extremely influential in Spanish modern art. However, his ties with Asia were deeply ingrained and Asian influences recur repeatedly in his work. He is best known for pioneering what we call the Saita series. Saita is a form of flamenco music, and it is this attempt to tie art with other, other disciplines such as music, which really helped to transform his work. So in the late 1950s, when he was attempting to find different ways of laying paint down onto the canvas, inspired by Asian calligraphy, he tried to discover the way a line could be formed in a continuous, unbroken sense, in which it could be very flexible, it could be gestural, but at the same time, it gave him this ability to create highly dense and intricate works. He began putting paint into a medical syringe, and then using the syringe, he started to weave these formations on the canvas. And all this at the same time, remembering he was basing this on the lyricality of flamenco music. He's also Singapore's only artist to penetrate deeply into the study of formalist and geometric abstraction, color theory, and subverting space. These are his early works called the kite paintings. He started these when he was studying in London. They're called the kite paintings because although he was part of the movement which engaged with formal abstraction, geometric shapes, and color theory, they were influenced by Malay kites from the Southeast Asian regions, the patterns that you see on the cloth and the structure. And actually this set of work is extremely important because it shows his difficulty in breaking away from narrative art, the idea that art always needed to have a certain content. It was only when he moved on to the series of what we call the wave paintings, which focus on revising hard abstraction into a softer and more infinite concept of form and line, is when he totally shed the idea of the subjective. Thanks to Charles for showing Chebet earlier, the image of Chebet's works at the ICA, because this is a student of his called MMU. On her own, her paintings look highly gestural, but then when they are seen in completion, installed within site-specific environments, we will actually realize that they employ the existing fabric of environment as background material, and she's attempting to transgress boundaries into a broader space, as well as generate an aspect of post-painting performance. So her paintings are attempts to simulate the colors and the frequencies found within her native environment, and then she brings the paintings out and she photographs them there. So there is that resonance between the painting itself and its environment. This is Luke, and these are works, the wax paraffin on steel chases works which he created. I thank you very much for having me here, and I do hope that these images just help to show that there are strong linkages of practice across Asia
in what the young artists are attempting to discover. And it's a really interesting dialogue that we can generate here from them. Thank you very much.